The envelope lay half buried in fresh Montana snow, its edges crisp and white against the cream-colored paper, and Blake Jensen knew, before he even picked it up, that finding it would change everything. He had been checking his trap lines along the ridges above Superior, Montana. That December morning in 1883, his horse's breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The snowfall from the previous night had blanketed everything in pristine white, and that pale square of paper stood out like a beacon against the unmarked terrain. Blake dismounted, his boots crunching through the snow's frozen crust, and retrieved the envelope with gloved hands. The paper was expensive, the kind that came from back east, and the handwriting on the front was delicate and feminine. It was addressed to someone named Catherine Morrison in Missoula, but there was no return address. Blake turned it over carefully. The seal had never been broken. He hesitated for only a moment before his cold fingers worked the envelope open. If someone had lost this out here in the wilderness, they likely needed help, and reading the contents might tell him how to provide it. The letter inside was dated 3 days prior, and the words made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. "Dearest Catherine, I hope this letter finds you well, though I pray you receive it before I do anything foolish. Life at the Morrison Ranch has become unbearable since Father passed. My stepbrother Thomas has decided that I should marry his business associate, a man named Virgil Crawford, who is 40 years my senior and has buried 2 wives already. Thomas says it is my duty to the family, that Crawford's investment in the cattle operation is contingent upon the marriage. I have refused, but Thomas grows more insistent by the day. He has taken to locking me in my room when Crawford visits, and I fear he will soon stop asking for my consent altogether. I am writing to you because I have nowhere else to turn. Mother died when I was young, and you were her dearest friend. I know I have no right to ask after all these years, but would you consider allowing me to stay with you in Missoula until I can find employment as a teacher or governess? I have some money that Father left me, though Thomas does not know about it. I plan to leave on the 20th if I can manage it. If you do not receive this letter in time, or if you cannot help, I will understand. I simply cannot marry that man. Your loving goddaughter, Margaret Bailey." Blake read the letter twice, his jaw clenching tighter with each word. The 20th had been yesterday. He looked at the envelope again, noting the careful script, and his mind began working through the logistics. Someone, presumably this Margaret Bailey, had tried to send this letter, but it had never made it to the post. How it ended up on a ridge above Superior, he could not guess. Perhaps she had hired someone to carry it who had lost it, or perhaps she had been traveling to mail it herself and dropped it. Either way, if her words were true, she was in trouble. The Morrison Ranch. Blake knew of it, though he had never been there himself. It lay about 15 miles northwest of Superior, a sprawling cattle operation that had once been prosperous under old Gerald Morrison's management. Gerald had died the previous spring, and there had been talk in town about how the operation was being run into the ground by his stepson. Blake had paid little attention to gossip then, but now he wished he had listened more carefully. He folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat, close to his chest. The temperature was dropping, and more snow was coming. He could feel it in the air, see it in the way the clouds were banking up against the mountains. If this young woman had tried to run yesterday and failed, she was likely in even more danger now. Men like Thomas Morrison did not take kindly to defiance, especially from women they considered their property to control. Blake had never been the kind of man who looked for trouble, but he had never been able to walk away from someone who needed help either. His conscience would not let him ignore this letter, not when he could potentially do something about it. He mounted his horse and turned toward Superior, his trap lines forgotten. He needed information before he could make any kind of move, and the best place to get it would be from Martha Henderson, who ran the boarding house in town and knew everyone's business within a 100-mile radius. The ride into Superior took him just over an hour, and by the time he arrived, the first fat snowflakes of the coming storm were beginning to fall. The town was small, just a collection of buildings clustered along the Clark Fork River, but it had everything a person needed: a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, the boarding house, and a small church. Blake tied his horse outside Martha's establishment and knocked the snow from his boots before entering. Martha looked up from where she was kneading bread dough in her kitchen, her round face breaking into a smile when she saw him. She was a widow in her 50s, kind-hearted but sharp as a tack, and she had been good to Blake since he had settled in the area 2 years prior. "Blake Jensen, you are going to catch your death riding around in weather like this," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Come in and warm yourself. I have coffee on the stove." "Thank you, Martha." Blake removed his hat and coat, hanging them by the door. "I actually came to ask you about something." Martha poured him a cup of coffee and gestured for him to sit at her kitchen table. "Ask away." "You know I am an open book." Blake pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to her. "I found this up on the ridge this morning. I know I should not have read it, but given the circumstances, I thought it might be important." Martha's expression grew serious as she read. When she finished, she set the letter down carefully and met Blake's eyes. "This is from Margaret Bailey. I have seen her in town a few times since her father died. Sweet girl, cannot be more than 22 or 23. She always looks nervous now, jumpy. Not like she used to be when Gerald was alive. Tell me about Thomas Morrison." Martha's mouth thinned into a disapproving line. "He is Gerald's stepson from his first wife. Gerald took him in when the boy was about 10, raised him like his own, but Thomas never had Gerald's character. He is greedy and mean, and he has a temper. Gerald kept him in line while he was alive, but now that Gerald's gone, Thomas has control of everything, or he thinks he does." "What about Margaret? What rights does she have, legally?" Martha shook her head. "Not many. She is an unmarried woman without parents. Thomas is her guardian by default, even though he is only her stepbrother. She would have to prove mistreatment in court, and even then, the judge would likely just assign her a different male guardian. And Virgil Crawford has money and influence. If Thomas wants this marriage to happen, the law will probably side with him." Blake felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "So if she ran, where would she go?" The letter says Miss Ola to Catherine Morrison. That was Gerald's sister. "She moved to Miss Ola after her husband died about 5 years back. She and Margaret were close." Martha picked up the letter again. "But if this never reached Catherine, then Margaret is either still at the ranch, or she tried to run and got caught, or she is out there somewhere in this storm." Martha's eyes widened. "You think she might have tried to deliver this herself?" "I do not know. But I found it on the ridge, and that is not on the route to Miss Ola from the Morrison ranch. It does not make sense unless something went wrong." Blake stood, his decision made. "I am going to ride out there." "Blake, you cannot just ride onto Thomas Morrison's property and demand to see his sister. He will run you off, or worse. Then I will think of something else." Blake put his coat back on. "But I cannot sit here knowing that young woman might be in danger." Martha studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You have a good heart, Blake Jensen. Too good, probably. But if you are set on this, at least be smart about it. Thomas goes into Miss Ola every Tuesday for business. He left this morning and will not be back until tomorrow. If you are going to the Morrison place, today is the day to do it." Blake felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Martha." "Do not thank me yet. You might be riding into a heap of trouble." She paused, then added, "But if you do find Margaret and she needs a place to stay, you bring her here. I will make sure she is safe until she can figure out what to do next." Blake nodded and headed for the door. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind was picking up. He had maybe 4 hours of decent riding weather left before the storm made travel truly dangerous. 15 miles to the Morrison Ranch, 15 miles back. He would have to move fast. The ride northwest was brutal. The wind cut through his coat like knives, and the snow reduced visibility to mere yards. Blake kept his head down and trusted his horse to follow the road. He had been this way once before, over a year ago when he had helped a neighbor track a lost cow. He remembered the landmarks, the twisted pine tree, the creek crossing, the boulder that looked like a sitting bear. When he finally saw the Morrison Ranch buildings emerging from the white curtain of snow, relief flooded through him. The main house was a large 2-story structure, well built but showing signs of neglect. The barn and outbuildings were in similar condition. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant someone was home. Blake dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post near the barn, giving the animal some shelter from the wind. He approached the house cautiously, his senses alert. There were no other horses visible, which hopefully meant Thomas really was away in Missoula. He knocked on the front door and waited. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Hello, anyone home?" Still nothing. Blake tried the door handle. Locked. He walked around the side of the house, peering through windows. Most of the rooms were empty, furniture covered with sheets. Then, on the second floor, he saw movement. A face appeared at one of the windows, pale and frightened. A young woman with dark hair pressed her hand against the glass, her eyes wide with surprise. Blake stepped back so she could see him better and called up to her. "Margaret Bailey. My name is Blake Jensen. I found your letter in the snow. I came to help." The face disappeared from the window and Blake heard muffled sounds from inside the house. He waited, uncertain what to do next. Then he heard a voice calling from above, faint through the glass. "The door is locked from the outside. I cannot get out." Blake's hands clenched into fists. Thomas had locked his own sister in her room. The anger that had been simmering in Blake's chest flared hot. "Which room?" he shouted. "Second floor, northwest corner." Blake ran back to his horse and retrieved his rope and a small axe he kept strapped to his saddle. He studied the house, looking for the best way up. There was a trellis on the west side, covered with the dead vines of what had probably been roses in the summer. It looked sturdy enough, and it led up to a small balcony on the second floor. He tested his weight on the trellis. It creaked but held. Blake climbed carefully, the wood cold and slippery under his gloves. When he reached the balcony, he found himself facing a set of French doors. Inside, he could see Margaret Bailey standing in her room, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The doors were secured with a simple latch on the inside and a padlock on the outside. Blake used the axe to break the padlock with 2 solid strikes. The doors swung open, and cold air rushed into the room. Margaret stepped back, her arms wrapped around herself. She wore a simple wool dress and a shawl, and she was shivering. "You really came," she whispered. Blake stepped inside, closing the doors behind him to keep the heat in. Now that he was looking at her properly, he could see that Martha had been right. She was young, probably around 22, with delicate features and dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. But there were shadows under her eyes, and her face was thin, as if she had not been eating well. "Your letter never reached Catherine Morrison," Blake said gently. "I found it on the ridge above Superior this morning. I came as soon as I read it." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "Then she does not know. I thought when I did not receive a reply, perhaps she did not want to help me, but she never received it at all." "What happened?" How did the letter end up on that ridge? Margaret moved to sit on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly. I gave it to one of the ranch hands, a man named Peter Collins. I paid him to take it to the post office in Superior. But when Thomas found out I had been corresponding with Catherine, he became enraged. He must have forced Peter to give him the letter. I do not know how it ended up where you found it. Perhaps Peter tried to run and dropped it, or perhaps Thomas took it from him and lost it himself. She looked up at Blake. Did Thomas send you? Is this some kind of test? No, Blake said firmly. Thomas is in Missoula. He does not know I am here. I came because I read your letter and I could not ignore it. No woman should be forced to marry against her will, and no brother should lock his sister in her room like a prisoner. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, and she quickly brushed them away. I am sorry. I am not usually so emotional. It has just been so difficult since Father died. You do not need to apologize. Blake glanced around the room. It was comfortable but sparse, with a bed, a small desk, and a wardrobe. The fireplace was cold, and there was very little firewood stacked beside it. How long have you been locked in here? 3 days. Thomas brings me 1 meal a day and tells me that I will stay here until I agree to marry Virgil Crawford. Her voice grew stronger, anger replacing the fear. But I will not marry that man. I do not care what Thomas threatens. I would rather die. It will not come to that, Blake said. Martha Henderson in Superior said you could stay at her boarding house if you need a safe place. We can leave right now before Thomas gets back. Margaret stood quickly. You know Martha? Yes, she is kind. I have met her a few times. Then her expression fell. But Thomas will come after me. He needs Crawford's money for the ranch. He will not let me go easily. Then we will figure something out. But first we need to get you out of here before this storm gets worse. Blake looked at her critically. Do you have warmer clothes? A coat, boots, gloves? Margaret nodded and moved to her wardrobe. She pulled out a heavy wool coat, a scarf, and sturdy boots. I have these. And I have the money my father left me, hidden in the hem of my mattress. Thomas does not know about it. Get it. And pack anything else you might need in a bag, but travel light. We have a hard ride ahead of us. While Margaret gathered her things, Blake went to the bedroom door. As expected, it was locked from the outside as well. He used his axe to break the lock, the sound echoing through the quiet house. When the door swung open, he did a quick search of the other rooms to make sure they were truly alone. The house was empty except for them. He returned to find Margaret dressed for travel, a canvas bag over her shoulder. She looked frightened but determined. I am ready. Good. We will go out the front door. It is faster than climbing down the trellis. They descended the stairs together, and Blake led her to where his horse waited. The storm had intensified, and visibility was down to less than 20 feet. Margaret looked at the weather with concern. Can we make it to Superior in this? We have to try, Blake said. If we stay here, Thomas will be back tomorrow, and then you will be trapped again. He helped Margaret mount his horse, then swung up behind her. She was stiff at first, clearly uncomfortable being so close to a man she had just met. But as they started moving and the cold bit into them, she leaned back against his chest for warmth. Blake wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady and guided the horse with the other hand. The journey back to Superior was grueling. The snow came down so thick that Blake could barely see his horse's ears, and the wind threatened to knock them from the saddle. He navigated by instinct and memory, trusting his sense of direction. Margaret was silent for most of the ride, but he could feel her shivering despite her warm coat. Talk to me, Blake said near her ear, loud enough to be heard over the wind. Tell me about your father. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then began to speak. My father was a good man. He came to Montana in the 60s to build a life. He married my mother, Sarah, and they started the ranch together. My mother died when I was 7, and father never remarried, though he dated Thomas's mother, Helena, for a time. When Helena died and left Thomas orphaned, father took him in. He always said family was the most important thing. Her voice caught. But Thomas is not family, not really. He never loved father the way I did. He only cared about what he could get from him. Your father would be proud of you for standing up for yourself, Blake said. I hope so. I just wish he were here, she paused. Why did you come for me? You do not know me, you had no obligation. Blake considered his answer carefully. I lost someone I loved a long time ago because I did not act when I should have. I was younger then, less sure of myself. I let her family push her into a marriage she did not want, and I did not fight for her. She died 2 years later, miserable and alone. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone in a similar situation, I would not hesitate. Margaret turned her head slightly, trying to see his face. I am sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago, but some regrets do not fade. They rode in silence for a while longer, and just when Blake was beginning to worry that he had lost the trail, the lights of Superior appeared through the snow. Relief washed over him, and he urged his horse toward Martha's boarding house. Martha must have been watching for them, because the door opened before they even dismounted. She rushed out with blankets, ushering them inside. Thank the Lord you made it. I have been worried sick. Blake helped Margaret down from the horse, and she nearly collapsed. Her legs had gone numb from the cold and the long ride. Blake caught her and half carried her inside, where the warmth of the fire hit them like a wall. Martha took over, wrapping Margaret in blankets and settling her by the hearth. I will get some hot soup and tea, Martha said. Blake, you see to your horse and then get yourself warmed up too. You both look half frozen. Blake nodded and headed back out into the storm. He led his horse to the small stable behind the boarding house, rubbed the animal down, and made sure it had feed and water. By the time he returned to the house, his hands and feet were numb, and his face felt like ice. Inside, Margaret was sipping tea with shaking hands, some color returning to her cheeks. Martha had set out bowls of stew and thick slices of bread. Blake sat down gratefully and began to eat, the hot food spreading warmth through his core. Martha sat with them, her expression serious. You two made it just in time. This storm is going to last through the night, maybe into tomorrow. No one is going anywhere until it clears. That gives us some time, Blake said, but we need to figure out what to do about Thomas. Margaret set down her teacup. He will come here. As soon as he gets back and finds me gone, he will search every place he can think of, and Superior is close enough that it will be one of the first. Let him come, Martha said firmly. This is my property and you are my guest. He has no legal right to take you from here by force. But he has Crawford's influence, Margaret said. And Crawford knows the territorial judge. They are business partners. If Thomas goes to the law, they will side with him. Blake leaned back in his chair, thinking. Then we need to make sure the situation is too public for them to simply sweep it under the rug. If people know what Thomas has been doing, locking you in your room and trying to force you into marriage, it will be harder for him to claim he was acting in your best interest. How do we do that? Margaret asked. We tell everyone, Martha said, catching on to Blake's line of thinking. By tomorrow night, every person in Superior will know your story, and I will make sure it spreads to the neighboring towns too. Public opinion can be a powerful thing. Margaret looked uncertain. I do not want to be the subject of gossip. Would you rather be married to Virgil Crawford? Blake asked gently, Margaret's jaw set. No, you are right. If it takes public scandal to stop this marriage, then so be it. The storm raged through the night, and Blake stayed at the boarding house, sleeping in one of Martha's spare rooms. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind howl and thinking about Margaret. She was brave, he would give her that. Not many women would have had the courage to defy their guardians the way she had, especially when the law was so stacked against them. He thought about the way she had felt in his arms during the ride, small and vulnerable but refusing to give up. He thought about her eyes, dark and expressive, full of intelligence and spirit. And he realized with a start that he was attracted to her, not just sympathetic to her situation, but genuinely drawn to her as a person. It was a complication he did not need. Blake had lived alone for 2 years, ever since settling in Montana. He had his trap lines, his small cabin up in the hills, and his solitude. He had convinced himself that was enough, that he did not need or want the complications of caring for another person. But now, lying in Martha's guest room with the storm raging outside, he could not deny what he was feeling. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Blake rose early and found Martha already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She gave him a knowing look as he sat down. "You have it bad already, do not you?" she said. Blake did not bother to deny it. "Is it that obvious? To me it is. I have known you long enough to read you, Blake Jensen." She set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "I do not know. First, we need to deal with Thomas. Everything else can wait." Margaret came downstairs shortly after, looking rested despite everything. She had changed into a clean dress that Martha had lent her, and her hair was neatly braided. She smiled shyly at Blake when she saw him. "Good morning. Thank you again for what you did yesterday. I know I said it last night, but I want you to know how grateful I am." "You are welcome," Blake said. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Warmer, certainly, and safer than I have felt in months." She sat down and Martha brought her a plate of food. "What happens now?" Before Blake could answer, there was a loud banging on the front door. All three of them froze. Martha set down her coffee pot and went to answer it, Blake following close behind. Margaret stayed in the kitchen, her face pale. Martha opened the door to reveal a tall, thin man with a sharp face and cold eyes. Thomas Morrison. He was dressed in traveling clothes, snow still clinging to his coat, and his expression was furious. "Where is she?" he demanded without preamble. "I know she is here." Martha crossed her arms. "Good morning to you too, Thomas, and who might you be looking for?" "Do not play games with me, Martha. My sister Margaret. Someone broke into my home yesterday and abducted her. I tracked the horse prints here before the snow covered them." "Abducted?" Blake stepped forward. "That is an interesting choice of words for a woman who escaped from a room where you had locked her in." Thomas's eyes narrowed as he looked Blake up and down. "And who are you?" "Blake Jensen. I am the one who helped Margaret leave your ranch." "She is a grown woman, not a child, and you have no right to keep her prisoner." "I am her legal guardian and I was keeping her safe. She is not in her right mind. She needs protection from making foolish decisions." Thomas tried to push past Martha into the house, but Blake blocked his path. "She is not going anywhere with you," Blake said quietly. "She told me what you have been trying to do, forcing her to marry Virgil Crawford. That is not protection. That is exploitation." Thomas's face flushed red. "How dare you interfere in family business? Margaret, get out here right now." Margaret appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, her chin lifted defiantly. "No, Thomas, I am not coming back with you. I am done being your pawn." "You ungrateful little fool. Do you have any idea what you have done?" "Crawford has already invested $50,000 in the ranch on the promise of this marriage. If you refuse him, he will pull out and the ranch will fail. Everything Father built will be gone." "Then you should have managed the ranch better," Margaret said coldly. "Father left it in good condition. You are the one who ran it into debt with your gambling and poor decisions. Do not blame me for your failures." Thomas looked like he wanted to hit her, but Blake's presence stopped him. "This is not over," Thomas said. "I will go to the judge. I will have you declared incompetent and assigned back to my custody." "Try it," Martha said. "But you should know that by the end of today, everyone in Superior and the surrounding towns will know exactly what you have been doing. Locking a young woman in her room, starving her, trying to force her into marriage with a man old enough to be her grandfather. Let us see how the judge feels about that." Thomas's expression shifted to something uglier. "You are making a mistake, all of you. Virgil Crawford is a powerful man. He does not take kindly to being embarrassed." "Then he should not have tried to buy a wife," Blake said. Thomas pointed a finger at Margaret. "You will regret this. You have no money, no skills, no way to support yourself. You will come crawling back to me within a month, begging for help." "I would rather starve," Margaret said. Thomas glared at all of them for a long moment, then turned and stalked away. They watched him mount his horse and ride off toward the Morrison ranch. When he was gone, Margaret sagged against the doorframe. "That went better than I expected, actually. I thought he might try to drag me out by force." "He wanted to," Blake said, "but he knew that would not look good if we reported it. He will try the legal route first." Martha closed the door firmly. "We need to move fast. Blake, can you ride to the neighboring settlements and spread the word about what has been happening? The more people who know, the harder it will be for Thomas to manipulate the situation." "I can," Blake said, "but I do not like leaving Margaret unprotected." "I will be fine," Margaret said. "Martha has a shotgun, and I know how to use one too. Father taught me." Blake looked at her with new respect. "All right, I will be back by nightfall." He spent the day riding from homestead to homestead, town to town, telling Margaret's story to anyone who would listen. The response was overwhelmingly sympathetic. Most people had heard rumors about Thomas Morrison's character, and the idea of him forcing his sister into an unwanted marriage outraged them. By the time Blake returned to Superior that evening, he was confident that public opinion was firmly on Margaret's side. When he arrived back at the boarding house, he found Martha and Margaret in the parlor, going through the classified advertisements in several newspapers. "What are you doing?" Blake asked. Margaret looked up, her eyes brighter than he had seen them. "Looking for employment opportunities. I need to be able to support myself, and I am qualified to work as a teacher or a governess. There are several positions advertised in Helena and Butt." Blake felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her leaving, but he pushed it aside. "That is a good idea. The more independent you are, the less power Thomas has over you." "Exactly," Margaret said. She hesitated, then added, "Blake, I want to thank you again. Not just for rescuing me, but for believing me. You did not have to trust that my letter was telling the truth. You could have thought I was exaggerating or being dramatic." "I know the look of real fear," Blake said, "and I saw it in your eyes yesterday when I found you locked in that room. No one who was exaggerating would have looked like that." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a current of understanding and mutual respect. Blake felt his heart rate increase, and he had to look away before he said something he was not ready to say. Over the next week, an uneasy peace settled over the situation. Thomas did not return to Superior, but word came back through various channels that he and Virgil Crawford were indeed planning to take the matter to the territorial judge. Margaret remained at Martha's boarding house, helping with chores to earn her keep and waiting for responses to the employment inquiries she had sent out. Blake found himself inventing excuses to visit Superior more often than was strictly necessary. He told himself he was just checking to make sure Margaret was safe, but the truth was he simply wanted to see her. They would sit in Martha's parlor and talk for hours about everything and nothing. Margaret was well-read and intelligent, with opinions on politics and literature that she was not afraid to share. Blake found himself fascinated by the way her mind worked, the way she could find humor even in difficult situations. One afternoon, about 10 days after the rescue, Blake arrived to find Margaret packing her few belongings. "Are you leaving?" he asked, his stomach dropping. She looked up with a sad smile. "I received a letter this morning. There is a family in Helena looking for a governess for their 3 children. They are offering room, board, and a small salary. It is not much, but it is honest work and it will give me independence. When do you leave?" "The stage leaves tomorrow morning." Blake nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "That is good news. You will do well there." Margaret set down the dress she had been folding and looked at him directly. "Blake, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why have you been visiting so often?" "At first, I thought it was because you wanted to make sure I was safe from Thomas. But Thomas has not made a move in over a week, and you are still here almost every day." Blake felt his face grow warm. He was not a man who found it easy to talk about his feelings, but Margaret deserved honesty. "I have been coming because I enjoy your company. These past days, talking with you, learning about you, they have been the happiest I have had in a long time." Margaret's expression softened. "I have enjoyed them too. You are a good man, Blake Jensen, kind and brave and honorable. Any woman would be lucky to have you." "Then do not go to Helena," Blake said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Stay here, stay with me." Margaret's eyes widened. "Blake, we barely know each other. We have known each other for less than 2 weeks. I know. And I know this is fast, maybe too fast. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. When I read your letter in the snow, something inside me knew that finding it was important, that you were important, and every day since then has only confirmed it." Margaret crossed the room to stand in front of him. She reached up and touched his face gently. "I feel it too. This connection between us, it is like nothing I have experienced before, but I cannot stay here and be dependent on anyone's charity, not even yours. I need to prove to myself that I can stand on my own." "Then let me come with you," Blake said. "I can find work in Helena. I am good with my hands and there is always need for trappers and hunters. We would not have to be together, not right away. But we could court properly, take the time to really get to know each other." Margaret looked torn. "What about your life here? Your cabin, your trap lines?" "I can trap anywhere. And a cabin is just wood and nails. You are more important." Tears filled Margaret's eyes and she shook her head. "You are making this so hard. I want to say yes. Every part of me wants to say yes. But I am scared, Blake. I just escaped one situation where a man was trying to control my life. I need to be sure that I am choosing my own path, not just trading one dependence for another." Blake took her hands in his. "I understand, and I would never want you to feel trapped or controlled. So how about this? You go to Helena and take the governess position. I will stay here and give you space. But I will write to you if you will let me. And in a few months, when you have had time to establish yourself and be sure of what you want, if you still feel about me the way I feel about you, I will come to Helena. And if you do not, I will respect that too." Margaret smiled through her tears. "That is more than fair. Yes, write to me. I would like that very much." The next morning, Blake drove Margaret to the stage stop in his wagon. Martha came along to see her off, pressing a package of food and a warm shawl into Margaret's hands. When the stage arrived, Blake helped Margaret with her bags and they stood facing each other awkwardly. "Be safe," Blake said. "And write to me when you arrive so I know you got there all right." "I will," Margaret promised. Then, impulsively, she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, Blake, for everything." Blake watched the stage until it disappeared from view, his hand touching the spot where her lips had been. Martha stood beside him, her expression sympathetic. "You are doing the right thing," she said, giving her space to choose. "I hope so," Blake said. "Because if I just let the best thing that ever happened to me ride away, I am going to feel like the biggest fool in Montana." The next 3 months were the longest of Blake's life. He threw himself into his work, checking trap lines, hunting, and taking on odd jobs around Superior to keep himself busy. But every evening he would return to his cabin and write to Margaret. He told her about his day, about the wildlife he saw, about the changing seasons. And she wrote back, long letters full of details about her life in Helena, the children she cared for, the books she was reading through their correspondence. Blake felt like he got to know the real Margaret, not just the frightened woman he had rescued, but the full person she was. She was witty and observant, with a dry sense of humor that made him laugh. She was also deeply thoughtful, wrestling with questions about her future and what she wanted from life. In her letters, she told him about the legal battle with Thomas. Virgil Crawford had indeed taken the matter to the territorial judge, seeking to have Margaret returned to Thomas's custody. But the judge, influenced by the public outcry and Margaret's own testimony about her treatment, had ruled in her favor. She was declared legally independent, free to make her own decisions. Thomas had been furious, and the ranch had indeed gone into foreclosure when Crawford pulled his investment. The last Margaret had heard, Thomas was planning to leave Montana entirely. Blake was glad she was free from that situation, but he was also impatient. 3 months felt like 3 years. He wanted to see her, to be near her, to find out if the feelings they had developed through letters would translate to real life. Then, in early April, he received a letter that made his heart race. "Dear Blake, I have been thinking a great deal about what you said before I left, about giving me time to be sure of my own mind. I appreciate that more than you know, and these months have taught me that I am capable of independence, of making my own way in the world. But they have also taught me something else, that independence does not mean being alone. The family I work for is wonderful, but Helena does not feel like home. It does not feel like home because you are not here. I do not need more time to know how I feel about you. I knew it the day I left Superior, and every letter since has only confirmed it. So I am asking you now, if the offer still stands, will you come to Helena? I want to see you. I want to see if what we have through letters is just as real in person, and if it is, then I want to build a life with you wherever that may be. Yours always, Margaret." Blake read the letter 3 times, a grin spreading across his face. Then he immediately began packing. He told Martha he was leaving for Helena, settled his affairs in Superior, and was on the road within 2 days. The journey to Helena took 3 days by horseback, and Blake made the trip in a state of nervous anticipation. What if Margaret had changed her mind? What if she realized that the reality of him did not match the person she had built up in her letters? What if he had waited too long, but when he arrived in Helena and found the address she had given him, all his doubts vanished? Margaret was in the front yard of a large, elegant home, playing with 3 children. She looked up when she heard his horse, and her face lit up with pure joy. She ran to him, and Blake dismounted just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her in his embrace. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came," Blake said. "I would ride 1,000 miles to be with you." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining. "I missed you. I missed you so much." "I missed you too." Blake cupped her face in his hands. "Margaret, I know I said we should take our time and court properly, but I need to tell you something. I love you. I have loved you since that first day when I found you locked in that room, looking so scared but so determined not to give up. And every day since has only made me love you more. Margaret's smile was radiant. "I love you too, Blake. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you climbed that trellis to rescue me. But I know I loved you completely the day you let me go, because you cared more about what I needed than what you wanted." Blake kissed her then, a deep, tender kiss that held all the longing and hope of the past 3 months. When they finally broke apart, the three children were staring at them with wide eyes, and an older woman had emerged from the house, smiling knowingly. "You must be Blake Jensen," the woman said. "Margaret has told us all about you. I am Mrs. Thornton, her employer." Blake tipped his hat. "Pleased to meet you, madam." Mrs. Thornton looked between Blake and Margaret, her expression warm. "I take it you two have some things to discuss." "Margaret, why do not you take the afternoon off? The children and I will be just fine." Margaret looked grateful. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. Are you sure?" "Quite sure, dear. Go on." Margaret took Blake's hand and led him away from the house toward a small park nearby. They sat on a bench overlooking a pond, and for a moment they just looked at each other as if making sure the other was real. "I cannot believe you are really here," Margaret said. "Where else would I be?" Blake threaded his fingers through hers. "Margaret, I do not have much. A little money saved, some skills, and a willingness to work hard. But if you will have me, I promise to spend the rest of my life making you happy." Margaret laughed softly. "Blake Jensen, is that a proposal?" Blake felt his face flush. "I suppose it is, though I am doing a terrible job of it. I do not even have a ring." "I do not need a ring." Margaret turned to face him fully. "But yes, I will marry you. I would be honored to be your wife." Blake pulled her close and kissed her again, and this time there was a promise in it, a commitment to the future they would build together. They were married a month later, in a small ceremony in Helena with Mrs. Thornton and her family as witnesses. Blake had found work as a guide for hunting parties, a job that paid well and used his skills. They rented a small house on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy but enough for the two of them. Their first year of marriage was full of adjustments and discoveries. Blake learned that Margaret talked in her sleep and that she could not cook to save her life, though she was determined to learn. Margaret learned that Blake was an early riser who liked his coffee strong and his mornings quiet, and that he had a habit of whittling small animals out of wood when he was thinking. But more than the small quirks, they learned that they worked well together. When Blake was home from his guiding trips, they would spend evenings reading together, discussing the news, or simply sitting in comfortable silence. When he was away, Margaret would write him letters that he would find waiting for him when he returned, full of news and affection. In their second year of marriage, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. Blake was overjoyed, though also terrified. He had never been a father before and was not sure he knew how to be one. But Margaret was calm and confident, assuring him that they would figure it out together. Their son was born in March of 1886, a healthy baby with Blake's dark hair and Margaret's eyes. They named him Gerald after Margaret's father, and Blake held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Blake whispered. "He is ours," Margaret said, looking up at her husband with love. "Our family." As Gerald grew, Blake found that fatherhood suited him. He loved teaching his son to ride, to track, to appreciate the wilderness that surrounded them. And Margaret loved watching them together, the two people she loved most in the world. 3 years after Gerald was born, they had a daughter, whom they named Sarah after Margaret's mother. Sarah was a fiery, spirited child who kept them both on their toes. And 2 years after that, they had another son, named Peter, after the ranch hand who had tried to help Margaret deliver her letter all those years ago. As their family grew, so did Blake's business. He had started a guiding company that employed several men and had a reputation throughout Montana for excellence and safety. Margaret, meanwhile, had begun tutoring children in Helena, using her skills as a teacher to help families who could not afford formal schooling. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were happy. One winter evening, nearly 10 years after Blake had found Margaret's letter in the snow, they sat together by the fire in their home. The children were asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet. Blake was whittling, as he often did in the evenings, and Margaret was reading. "Blake," Margaret said suddenly, "do you ever think about that day? The day you found my letter?" Blake looked up from his carving. "All the time. It was the best day of my life, even if I did not know it at the time." Margaret set down her book and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. "I think about it too, about how easily things could have gone differently. If the snow had covered the letter, if you had not been checking your trap lines that day, if you had decided it was not your business to interfere." "But I did find it," Blake said, "and I did interfere. And now we have this life, this family. I would not change a single thing." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "Neither would I. You saved me, Blake. Not just from Thomas and that awful marriage, but from a life without love, without purpose. You gave me everything I did not even know I wanted." Blake put down his whittling and wrapped his arm around her. "You saved me too. I was so lonely before I met you, so convinced that I was meant to be alone. You brought light into my life, Margaret. You and the children, you are everything to me." They sat together in the firelight, comfortable and content. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, just as it had been falling that December morning 10 years ago. But this time, Blake was not alone in the wilderness. He was home, with the woman he loved and the family they had built together. "Tell me the story again," Margaret said softly. "About finding the letter." Blake smiled. He had told this story many times over the years to their children and to friends, but Margaret never seemed to tire of hearing it. "I was checking my trap lines," Blake began. "The snow was fresh and the morning was cold. I almost did not see it, that little square of cream-colored paper against all that white. But something made me look closer, and when I picked it up and read what you had written, I knew I had to help." "You rode into a storm to save a woman you had never met," Margaret said. "Most men would have waited or decided it was not their concern. I could not wait. The letter was so desperate, so afraid. I kept thinking about you, locked in that room, wondering if anyone would help. I had to try." Margaret lifted her head to look at him. "I was so frightened when I saw you at the window. I thought Thomas had sent you, that it was some kind of trap. But then you spoke, and your eyes were so kind. I knew I could trust you." "Best decision you ever made," Blake teased, and Margaret laughed. "One of many good decisions. Like saying yes when you asked me to marry you, like choosing to build this life with you." Blake kissed her forehead. "I love you, Margaret Jensen. And I love you, Blake." They sat together as the fire burned low and the snow continued to fall outside. Their children slept safely upstairs. Their home was warm and secure, and their future stretched out before them, full of promise. Years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. Gerald grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who studied law and eventually became an advocate for legal reforms to protect the rights of women and orphans. Sarah became a teacher like her mother, opening a school for girls in Helena. And Peter followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a guide and wilderness expert. Blake and Margaret grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They never forgot that December day when fate had brought them together through a letter lost in the snow. It became a family legend, a story told and retold to grandchildren who would gather around the fire on winter evenings. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Blake surprised Margaret with a gift. It was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with scenes of mountains and snow. Inside, carefully preserved, was the letter he had found all those years ago. "I kept it," Blake said as Margaret held the yellowed paper with trembling hands. "I know I probably should have given it to you years ago, but it felt like such an important part of our story. I wanted to preserve it." Margaret read the words she had written 3 decades earlier, words of fear and desperation from a young woman who had no idea that her plea for help would lead to such happiness. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping this, for keeping me, for building this beautiful life with me." Blake took her hands in his, hands that were now marked with age and hard work but still strong and capable. "It has been my privilege and my joy, every single day." They renewed their vows that anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. And as Blake looked at Margaret, still beautiful to him despite the silver in her hair and the lines on her face, he silently thanked whatever providence had led him to that ridge on that December morning so long ago. The final years of their life together were peaceful. They sold the guiding business to Peter and moved to a smaller house in town where they could be close to their children and grandchildren. Blake's hands grew too stiff for whittling, but he took up painting instead, creating landscapes of the Montana wilderness he loved. Margaret continued to tutor children well into her 70s, her sharp mind and gentle patience making her beloved by generations of students. On a spring morning in 1920, Blake woke to find Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep, a small smile on her face. He held her hand and wept, mourning the loss of his great love but also grateful for the 40 years they had shared. Blake lived for 2 more years after Margaret died, cared for by his children but never quite the same without her. He spoke of her often, always with love and admiration. And when he finally passed away on a quiet winter evening, his family found him in his chair by the fire, a painting of a snowy Montana ridge on his easel and a letter, yellowed with age, held carefully in his hands. The family buried him next to Margaret, and on the stone they carved the words. He found her letter in the snow, rode to town and brought her home that night, together forever. And so ended the story of Blake Jensen and Margaret Bailey, 2 souls brought together by chance and bound together by love, who built a life that touched countless others, and left a legacy of courage, compassion, and unwavering devotion that would be remembered for generations to come. Their descendants would gather every winter, on the anniversary of that December day when Blake found the letter, to tell the story again. They would speak of the snowstorm, the desperate ride, the rescue from the locked room. They would talk about the letters exchanged during those long months apart, the reunion in Helena, and the decades of happiness that followed. But more than the specific events, they would talk about what Blake and Margaret represented. The idea that love can come when you least expect it, that courage and kindness can change the course of a life, and that the smallest decisions, like stopping to pick up a letter in the snow, can lead to the greatest joys. The house where Blake and Margaret raised their children still stands in Helena, now a historical landmark. Visitors can tour the rooms where 3 generations of the Jensen family grew up, can see Blake's paintings and Margaret's books, and can read the original letter that started it all, carefully preserved in a glass case. And every December, when the snow falls on Montana, people still tell the story of the cowboy who found a letter in the snow, rode to town through a blizzard, and brought home the love of his life, beginning a legacy that would endure long after both of them were gone. It is a story of hope, of rescue, of 2 people who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. A story that reminds us all that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single act of kindness and a willingness to help someone in need.